Hello and welcome to this chess endgame review of Bishop versus Knight Part 1. In this first video, I will show an example where the bishop has the upper hand and the winning advantage in this position. And in the follow-up video, Part 2, I will show another example where the knight has the winning advantage. Okay, let's begin here. In this position, it is black's turn to move, and this game looks quite equal. It looks like it may be hard for black to find any kind of winning advantage here, but when it comes to knight versus bishop, the bishops are stronger in a position where it is open, where the diagonals are clear, so the bishop can maneuver around the board, and also where there is action taking place on both sides of the board. So we see here there are pawns on the queen side here and on the king side. So that can pose a problem for the knight, which takes longer, of course, than a bishop to maneuver back and forth across the board. Whereas this bishop can just target from a long distance and jump across the board in one move. So the game continues here with black to move, and we have king to f8 in this position. So in the end game, it's always a good idea to bring your king into the action to help assist. And so white does the same. So it's a race to get their kings into the center of the board. And here, black is placed a little better than white's king. And the game continues with h4 here. So another strategy in an endgame like this is to move your pawns to squares that are the opposite color of your opponent's bishop, so they will be less likely to, they cannot be targeted basically when they're on the opposite color squares. But there may be instances where you want to keep your pawns on the same color square to take squares away from the bishop. But here black plays h4 to prevent these pawns on the king side from becoming targets by that bishop. And so here the bishop just repositions back to c8 here, where it can remaneuver to this diagonal from a6 down towards the king. And another advantage, well, both sides are able to use this possibility. We see how the bishop, when it was here on d7, it guarded all these squares that the knight could move to. But then again, the knight was covering the squares that the bishop could move to as well. So that works both ways. All right, so knight to f3 is played. This knight will attempt to remaneuver. One possibility is to maybe jump here and target both of these pawns on f7 and h7. And so the game continues with a check by the bishop. And now white's king is forced to make a decision. Does he move to the king side to help protect these pawns, or does he stay over here by the queen side to protect his lone isolated pawn here? And in this position, white moved to king to c3 to help protect this pawn. Now if he went to king to e3 here, then black could just play king to c5, and this pawn would fall with a combined attack by the king and the bishop, as it is still on a light square here. All right, now in the game, instead of this, king to c3, after this check, king to c3 was played to help protect this pawn. And so the game continued with h6 to take away squares of this knight, to prevent the knight from being able to jump up here and fork these pawns. So that's another strategy against the knight is to set up your pawns in such a way that they cover the possible squares the knight could move to and limit that knight's mobility. So the king cuts off the knight here. The pawn cuts off this g5 square, and so the knight has less options. And the game continued with knight to d4 now, the only square where the knight can move forward and be protected by the king here. So now g6 is played, further cutting off this knight, and the knight must retreat and reposition to try and find some way into black's position here. And king to e4 is played. So now black decides to go after these pawns on the king side, since white's king and knight have moved to the queen side. So knight to e3 is played to help protect these pawns. But after this move, now we have pawns pushing forward, and this also once again cuts off the knight from being able to jump over to g4. And so the game continues with king to d2. So now white is aware of this danger of the knight and pawns creating weaknesses here on the king side. And f4 is played by black, attacking the knight. And the knight jumps to g4 here, attacking this pawn. But another possibility after f4 may have been knight to c2 here, but then that may allow this sequence, bishop to f1, attacking the pawn, and then after the knight protects, we have the king remaneuvering here, and after f3 to try and cut this king off, the game would continue with g5, and if the pawn captures, the king could capture, and the king would infiltrate down to h4, and then g3, and king and bishop would be able to capture this pawn here. And so instead of that, white did not want to allow black that opportunity. So instead, after f4, the knight moves up to g4 here. And then we have h5 chasing this knight. So the knight moves to f6 with check here. And after the king attacks, the knight once again is chased around the board here. And bishop to c8, attacking this knight again. And so if the knight would move to c5 here, then the king could just move in, and after this knight move, we have bishop to f5. So attacking this knight, and black would be able to capture this h-pawn and penetrate into this king side and have a passed pawn moving down through here. So once again, white wanted to avoid that situation, and so after the attack on this knight, we have knight to f8, and then we have g5 pushing forward here, and after g3, because if the pawn captures and the king captures, once again this king would help escort his pawn through here. He could move forward, push with the bishop, something would break through with the help of this king. And instead, in the game, after g5, g3 was played here. And the game continued like this. After g3, capture of this h4 pawn. So after a recapture, now the king infiltrates into this king side position. And we look here, the evaluation shows a 1 1/4 pawn worth of material in favor of black. But now that this pawn will be captured after this move, we have this possibility, just attacking the bishop, or excuse me, the bishop attacking the knight. So we see how this bishop is able to just outmaneuver the knight in this open position, just chasing the knight around, cutting off squares with the pawns. And so the knight is forced to move here. And here the bishop just backs up and cuts off squares from this bishop, or excuse me, the bishop cuts off squares from the knight. And the game continued with b4, king captures. Now white's king maneuvers up the board, but then this is the continuation. The pawn will just start marching down here, and black will queen before white. And after a few final moves here, we see the queen will just, queen and bishop will just overpower white, and black will win in this position. And so this was part one of this two-part series. This first video in bishop versus knight. And this example shows how in an open position where the bishop is free to maneuver across the board, and especially when there is action on both sides of the board where the bishop can get there faster than the knight will have difficulties trying to cover everything, especially when there's action on both sides of the board and the board is wide open. And also remember, you can use your pawns to help assist the bishop as well as your king to cut off those squares of the knight to limit its mobility. So I hope you've enjoyed this part one of bishop versus knight. And if you have, please like and subscribe. Feel free to leave comments or suggestions. And I hope you will stick around and enjoy the part two of this bishop versus knight. If the video does not pop up after this one, you can check out my Nick Butts Chess channel and find that bishop versus knight part two. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.